truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, June 13th, 2024, the 1,240th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. With a paid subscription, you get the ad-free experience. You can participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you are invited to join the interactive live streams every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack or a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so there is so much going on today, and most of it is really, really weird and very entertaining as far as I'm concerned. Some people might be overwhelmed with concern about the state of our world in the future. And hey, I get it. I agree. Things could get weird, but we've already had them get weird, and we've gotten used to it, and we've gotten over it and gotten through it. So I feel like maybe it's going to be more weird for other people. And as I say that and think that, I look back to the beginning of 2020 when I was pretty well indoctrinated. I knew a great deal about the central narrative, but virtually nothing else. I wasn't a truth seeker. I was more or less just pursuing my self-interest, and my politics matched that to a large degree. I was a normie, and I bet at that time, people who had been truth seekers throughout their lives and were maybe never indoctrinated at all to begin with were probably looking at people like me and thinking, gosh, things are going to get weird for that guy. I hope he doesn't make them weird for me. And hey, if that's you, I hope that I did not contribute too greatly to making it weird for you. But things did get weird for me, and they got weird for a whole lot of other people. You could say they got weird for just about everybody, even the people who were expecting things to get weird. And so some concern, yeah, I get it. But you can't change it. All you can do is prepare. And if you're listening to this show, chances are you have already prepared yourself mentally, emotionally, and practically for however weird the year gets, better than probably almost everyone you know. So it's nice to be able to find a little humor in it, a little humor in the G7 leaders staring up at the sky, wondering what's about to happen. Just a fake American president and 5 failed leaders of foreign countries, along with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and for whatever reason, Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, along with, I guess, her +1. Just a bunch of idiots looking at the sky, waiting for a parachute man to land. I mean, was it always like this? Was it always like this and I just didn't notice and other people didn't point it out? I think back to 2008 and 2012, watching the ridiculous things Barack Obama would do. Was any of it this ridiculous? Was it this up in our faces, this obvious? And I guess the answer is I don't know, but things are really ridiculous. Yesterday, there was a picture released of supposed Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman walking around. Now he wears a suit, by the way, not a hoodie and shorts and sneakers. Now he wears a suit, still with sneakers, and still with actually a hoodie as well. But he does wear a tie. He just puts a necktie around his neck and drapes it down over the front of his hooded sweatshirt. And we are supposed to take all of this seriously and do as the government tells us. And more importantly, do what the television tells us. So I was planning to talk about some geopolitics and foreign affairs today. There was an article in The Economist yesterday analyzing who might be the likely choice in Iran for Ibrahim Raisi after his helicopter crashed and he died, or so we are told. And it occurred to me that a month ago, there were not elections scheduled in the UK, in France, or in Iran. And now there are elections scheduled in all 3 countries, and all 3 elections are going to be occurring within the span of a week from June 28th to July 4th. So in a little over 2 weeks, 3 critical world powers will be electing new leadership in their government. And obviously, of course, that is the surface level story. It assumes all of this is politics as usual. It assumes that elections are real and everyone believes in their outcomes. And so, like I said, maybe we'll get deeply into that tomorrow. But for now, I just wanted to point out how odd it is that a month ago, no elections scheduled. 2 weeks from now, within 1 week, we will have all 3 elections. But there's a lot going on here, too, and there are some pretty important narratives lighting up the old switchboard. And so let's start out with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, who we've been told for a while now, is illegitimate because Clarence Thomas went on vacation with a rich friend who supports Republicans, and his wife doesn't have the right opinions about the very violent insurrection and the obviously stolen in broad daylight 2020 election. And then Justice Alito, well, oh man, his wife, she's a real problem too. She flies flags on her own property, and those flags have unapproved messages. And therefore, her husband is not allowed to be a judge. If these men want to be judges, they had better get their wives under control, particularly the black one with the white wife. I mean, honestly, do these people even understand what they're saying anymore? If Clarence Thomas was a brain-dead communist who took it easy on pedophiles, and a bunch of MAGA extremists suggested that he put his very strong white woman of a wife in place, they would have an absolute meltdown. It might not ever end. They would bring the N-word back into style just so they could take it out of style again. Oh, wait, they already did that with hip-hop music. But yes, the Supreme Court that has these two totally unfit justices that should have recused themselves for not being able to control their wives, well, they're handing down decisions. They released 3 opinions today. No one's talking about the other 2. I haven't gone through them yet. One was a labor issue about Starbucks employees who were trying to unionize, and the other is about intellectual property and copyright law stemming from a man who wanted to trademark the phrase Trump too small and sell merchandise after Trump's debate exchange with Marco Rubio in 2016. But let's focus in on the other one, the one that's getting all the headlines, the one that's being touted as a victory for women's rights and a victory for the pro-choice cause. And let's go to NPR's own Nina Totenberg, who, it's worth noting, is the sister of Amy Totenberg, the judge presiding in the Curling v. Raffensperger case in Georgia that is ongoing for now 5 years, the case where cyber expert J. Alex Halderman has proven exhaustively that electronic voting machines cannot be expected to produce a reliable outcome that reflects the will and intent of the voter, and they are wide open and vulnerable to manipulation. But here is the sister Nina Totenberg writing for American state media. Supreme Court rejects challenge to FDA's approval of mifepristone. The U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday tossed out a challenge to the FDA's rules for prescribing and dispensing abortion pills. By a unanimous vote, the court said the anti-abortion doctors who brought the challenge had failed to show that they had been harmed, as they do not prescribe the medication and thus had no skin in the game. The court said that the challengers, a group called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, had no right to be in court at all since neither the organization nor its members could show they had suffered any concrete injury. Writing for the court, Justice Brett Kavanaugh dismissed every conceivable argument that the anti-abortion doctors had a right to sue. Indeed, as he observed, federal law explicitly says that doctors cannot be forced to perform or assist in abortions or to treat patients with complications from mifepristone. Similarly, he wrote, doctors have no generalized right to sue because they object to a general government policy. If the government raises the speed limit, he noted, emergency room doctors couldn't challenge that policy on grounds that it increased the number of automobile accident cases. Indeed, Kavanaugh wrote that in the FDA drug approval context, quote, virtually all drugs come with complications, risks, and side effects, end quote. But doctors, quote, have never had standing to challenge FDA's drug approvals simply on the theory that the use of the drug by others may cause more visits to the doctor, end quote. Now let's just listen to that one more time. Doctors have never had standing to challenge FDA's drug approvals simply on the theory that use of the drug by others may cause more visits to the doctors. So the unelected bureaucrats at the Food and Drug Administration have the authority to determine whether or not a drug can be sold. And we saw through the COVID quote-unquote vaccine process how seriously the FDA takes their role. The case is about mifepristone, but it's not hard to see these issues being relevant in the future related to these quote-unquote vaccines. The court's action amounted to a legal off-ramp, leaving the FDA rules in place without directly addressing the regulations themselves. So one of the agencies in the administrative state one of the rule-making regulatory bodies, has their rules left in place as a result of this case. But many people believe we're about to see Chevron deference overturned by this court within the next couple of weeks, and that would seem to have a far bigger impact. This is a case not about abortion. This is a case about legal standing. The court's decision also avoided, at least for now, a challenge to the entire structure of the FDA's regulatory power to approve drugs and continually evaluate their safety, a system that for decades has been widely viewed as the gold standard for both safety and innovation. And it sounds like the woman at this state media outlet is doing public relations in favor of a government agency. It's so common that it doesn't even really seem weird anymore, but take a step back and think about that. This is establishment journalism. This is what we are told objective journalism looks and sounds like. She's reassuring us that the Food and Drug Administration is the gold standard for safety and innovation. Think about the food and the drugs that they allow to be introduced into the bodies of American men and women and children. But nope, she's just disseminating the slogans. Since the court reversed Roe versus Wade and the right to abortion in 2022, pills have become the most popular abortion method in the U.S. More than half the women who choose to terminate a pregnancy use a combination of pills approved by the FDA, including mifepristone, manufactured by Danco Laboratories and marketed as Mifeprex. The pill regimen was first approved 24 years ago, and over the past 7 years, the agency has approved changes in the dosing regimen and eliminated some restrictions that it found to be unnecessary. For instance, the pills can now be prescribed during the first 10 weeks of pregnancy instead of the original 7 weeks, and prescriptions can be filled by mail or at pharmacies instead of at a doctor's office. The result, according to Danco Labs, is that there have been fewer complications than when the drug was initially approved for just 7 weeks in 2000. Now, I know people have strong emotional reactions to any issue that concerns abortion, particularly with a fetus that is 10 weeks old. And I understand that people who have that reaction don't want to hear that it's easier for people to access those pills and drive up the number of abortions. But the courts are tasked with deciding on the law and tasked with considering the legal implications. The moral and cultural and political decisions should be handled elsewhere. The court's not there to enforce cultural standards and morality. The court's there to rule on constitutionality. Let's continue. We'll come back to that. Thursday's Supreme Court decision reversed a ruling by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, widely viewed as the most conservative federal appeals court in the country. Siding with the FDA in the case were virtually all the major medical associations in the country, as well as almost all the pharmaceutical and biotech companies, big and small, that are regulated by the agency, making this the rare case in which a government regulator and the industry it regulates were on the same side. Oh, yeah, that case is so rare. The FDA and the pharma companies on the same side? Who could even imagine it? Dr. Jeremy Levin, the CEO of Ovid Therapeutics, one of the pharmaceutical companies that sided with the FDA, earlier this year called the case a dagger at the heart of the entire industry. For now, though, the prospect of dismantling the regulatory powers of the FDA has been averted, but the direct challenge to abortion pills and their accessibility has not been resolved and could be revived in a different case. And naturally, all of the standard issue villagers on the Uniparty Left are going crazy over this decision. It is being touted as a victory for the pro-abortion crowd. They are celebrating. They were told that this was all about white men with toxic masculinity or something, threatening to take away women's rights or something. And now those evil white supremacists who make up the majority of the Supreme Court have done the thing that they feel good about just a couple weeks after doing all the things that made them feel very, very bad and very, very sad. At the beginning of the week, they were freaking out because there was audio, supposedly a recording of Samuel Alito's wife, bemoaning the fact that she was forced on a regular basis to look out at a pride flag. And she even threatened to hoist more of her own flags. It was horrifying. But for now, in their minds, I guess, the Supreme Court gets to live a few more days. This decision doesn't represent the court opining on abortion. This is just about standing. But because of the way it's being framed, all of those people who are upset about Clarence Thomas and upset about Samuel Alito are reaffirming the legitimacy of this court in front of their own audiences. And you might think, damn, those are some dumb commies. And sure, they are. But this is no different than standard issue villagers on the Uniparty right who think elections are legitimate because Glenn Youngkin won in Virginia. Now, obviously, unprincipled people are not going to care about their own inconsistency. But when they're out there controlling the public narrative and setting the terms of the public conversation, their inconsistencies do matter quite a lot to all the people listening to what they're saying. It doesn't make sense to be celebrating the court's decisions one week and then saying the next week that the court's illegitimate because the two conservative justices didn't recuse. And yes, they will try to make an exception and say that what Alito did signals a problem directly related to some issue of consequence in the case and therefore he should recuse. But that's nonsense. Under that same logic, the three liberal justices should recuse in any issue that has anything to do with abortion. Now let's think about this article from the state media outlet NPR. There were two direct quotations from Justice Kavanaugh's opinion in that article, and they weren't even full sentences. But let's go to the decision the court released. For this case, there is a syllabus prepared by the reporter of decisions, and it kind of summarizes things. And then we will get to some quotations from the opinion of the court written by Justice Kavanaugh and the concurring opinion written by Justice Clarence Thomas. But let's go through the few pages of this syllabus. Food and Drug Administration et al. V. Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine et al. In 2000, the Food and Drug Administration approved a new drug application for mifepristone tablets marketed under the brand name Mifeprex for use in terminating pregnancies up to 7 weeks. To help ensure that Mifeprex would be used safely and effectively, FDA placed additional restrictions on the drug's use and distribution. For example, requiring doctors to prescribe or to supervise prescription of Mifeprex, and requiring patients to have 3 in-person visits with the doctor to receive the drug. In 2016, FDA relaxed some of these restrictions, deeming Mifeprex safe to terminate pregnancies up to 10 weeks, allowing healthcare providers such as nurse practitioners to prescribe Mifeprex, and approving a dosing regimen that required just 1 in-person visit to receive the drug. In 2019, FDA approved an application for generic mifepristone. In 2021, FDA announced it would no longer enforce the initial in-person visit requirement. 4 pro-life medical associations and several individual doctors moved for a preliminary injunction that would require FDA to either rescind approval of mifepristone or to rescind FDA's 2016 and 2021 regulatory actions. Danco Laboratories, which sponsors Mifeprex, intervened to defend FDA's actions. Then they go through the series of decisions that brought this case to the Supreme Court, but we can skip that. Held. Plaintiffs lack Article 3 standing to challenge FDA's actions regarding the regulation of mifepristone. And here we get into the heart of the issues. And for readability's sake, I'm going to bypass some of the case citations. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this stuff, to go to supremecourt.gov and find opinions of the court. Article 3 standing is a bedrock constitutional requirement that this court has applied to all manner of important disputes. Standing is built on a single basic idea, the separation of powers. Article 3 confines the jurisdiction of federal courts to cases and controversies. Federal courts do not operate as an open forum for citizens to press general complaints about the way in which government goes about its business. To obtain a judicial determination of what the governing law is, a plaintiff must have a personal stake in the dispute. To establish standing, a plaintiff must demonstrate 1. that she has suffered or likely will suffer an injury in fact. That means an injury, a real injury, has been suffered. And that doesn't mean just like a sprained ankle. It means a real definable harm was done. 2, that the injury likely was caused or will be caused by the defendant. And 3, that the injury likely would be redressed by the requested judicial relief. The 2 key questions in most standing disputes are injury in fact and causation. By requiring the plaintiff to show an injury in fact, Article 3 standing screens out plaintiffs who might only have a general, legal, moral, ideological, or policy objection to a particular government action. So basically, you cannot just bring Article 3 courts your complaints. There are other venues for those concerns in our governmental structure. You have to actually show that you were harmed. Causation requires the plaintiff to establish that the plaintiff's injury likely was caused or likely will be caused by the defendant's conduct. Causation is ordinarily substantially more difficult to establish when, as here, a plaintiff challenges the government's unlawful regulation or lack of regulation of someone else. That is because unregulated parties often may have more difficulty linking their asserted injuries to the government's regulation or lack of regulation of someone else. Plaintiffs are pro-life, oppose elective abortion, and have sincere legal, moral, ideological, and policy objections to mifepristone being prescribed and used by others. Because plaintiffs do not prescribe or use mifepristone, plaintiffs are unregulated parties who seek to challenge FDA's regulation of others. So it's not these people whose behavior is being regulated by the FDA, and they're also not the ones suffering a harm caused by the defendant. Plaintiffs advance several complicated causation theories to connect FDA's actions to the plaintiff's alleged injuries in fact. None of these theories suffices to establish Article 3 standing. Plaintiffs first contend that FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone may cause downstream conscience injuries to the individual doctors. Even assuming that FDA's 2016 and 2021 changes to mifepristone's conditions of use cause more pregnant women to require emergency abortions, and that some women would likely seek treatment from these plaintiff doctors, the plaintiff doctors have not shown that they could be forced to participate in an abortion or provide abortion-related medical treatment over their conscience objections. Federal conscience laws definitively protect doctors from being required to perform abortions or to provide other treatment that violates their consciences. Now, this is just another one of those times where alarms should go off in terms of the implications there for other issues that we will probably see in the future when it comes to lawsuits over COVID vaccines and vaccine mandates in general. It's also important when considering what doctors did in going along with the vaccine mandates and the other treatment protocols throughout COVID. Again, federal conscience laws definitively protect doctors from being required to perform abortions or to provide other treatment that violates their consciences. Also, federal law protects doctors from repercussions when they have refused to participate in an abortion. The plaintiffs have not identified any instances where a doctor was required, notwithstanding conscience objections, to perform an abortion or to provide other abortion-related treatment that violated the doctor's conscience since mifepristone's 2000 approval. Further, Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, or EMTALA, neither overrides federal conscience laws nor requires individual emergency room doctors to participate in emergency abortions. Thus, there is a break in any chain of causation between FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone and any asserted conscience injuries to the doctors. Plaintiffs next assert that they have standing because FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone may cause downstream economic injuries to the doctors. The doctors cite various monetary and related injuries that they will allegedly suffer as a result of FDA's actions, in particular, diverting resources and time from other patients to treat patients with mifepristone complications, increasing risk of liability suits from treating those patients, and potentially increasing insurance costs. But the causal link between FDA's regulatory actions in 2016 and 2021 and those alleged injuries is too speculative, lacks support in the record, and is otherwise too attenuated to establish standing. Moreover, the law has never permitted doctors to challenge the government's loosening of general public safety requirements simply because more individuals might then show up at emergency rooms or in doctors' offices with follow-on injuries. Citizens and doctors who object to what the law allows others to do may always take their concerns to the executive and legislative branches and seek greater regulatory or legislative restrictions. And it is hard to argue that that is how the system is designed to work. Now, there have been a bunch of roadblocks built up to protect the system from the people and their complaints, which ends up leaving the people with virtually no recourse whatsoever when it comes to objecting what's done by these regulatory bodies. That is a problem with the expansion, infiltration, and corruption of the federal government, but that still doesn't make it the judicial branch's responsibility. Plaintiff medical associations assert their own organizational standing. Under the court's precedents, organizations may have standing, quote, to sue on their own behalf for injuries they have sustained, end quote. But organizations must satisfy the usual standards for injury in fact, causation, and redressability that applies to individuals. And they go through a long list of attempts to establish an injury in fact, to establish causation, and to assert redressability. And skipping ahead, finally, it was suggested that plaintiffs must have standing because otherwise it may be that no one would have standing to challenge FDA's 2016 and 2021 actions. That suggestion fails because the court has long rejected that kind of argument as a basis for standing. The assumption that if these plaintiffs lack standing to sue, no one would have standing is not a reason to find standing. Rather, some issues may be left to the political and democratic processes. So that's the syllabus. Kavanaugh writes in the opinion, if we were now to invent a new doctrine of doctor standing, there would be no principled way to cabin such a sweeping doctrinal change to doctors or to healthcare providers. Firefighters could object to relaxed building codes that increase fire risks. Police officers could sue to challenge a government decision to legalize certain activities that are associated with increased crime. Teachers in border states could sue to challenge allegedly lax immigration policies that lead to overcrowded classrooms. We decline to start the federal judiciary down that uncharted path. That path would seemingly not end until virtually every citizen had standing to challenge virtually every government action that they do not like, an approach to standing that this court has consistently rejected as flatly inconsistent with Article 3. Now, does anything we just went through seem like it revolves around the issue of abortion at all? It doesn't. This is about whether organizations and third parties can sue government regulatory agencies over harms that might potentially happen to other people. This seems to make practical sense, and it seems to uphold the separation of powers. Fox News, in its coverage, cited Justice Kavanaugh. Under Article 3 of the Constitution, a plaintiff's desire to make a drug less available for others does not establish standing to sue, nor do the plaintiff's other standing theories suffice. He went on, the plaintiffs have sincere legal, moral, ideological, and policy objections to elective abortion and to FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone. But under Article 3 of the Constitution, those kinds of objections alone do not establish a justiciable case or controversy in federal court. And so they sent it back down to the Fifth Circuit. And let's think about what Kavanaugh wrote and how that would look if we flipped it around, thought about the very deadly pandemic and the FDA barring the use of ivermectin, and hydroxychloroquine, but let's say instead that they had allowed the use of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine with COVID, and the American Medical Association, or some group of doctors that was getting really rich off the pandemic rather than abortion, had decided to sue, claiming that people were going to be harmed or that their businesses would be harmed. Would it make sense for the Supreme Court to hear that case? Is this the correct, principled, constitutional decision, or are they just following precedent? Because one of those is the point, and the other one is how we end up with the courts essentially creating our laws. Fox quotes Erin Hawley, the attorney for the civil rights firm Alliance Defending Freedom, who argued the case against the FDA, saying, "We are disappointed that the Supreme Court did not reach the merits of the FDA's lawless removal of common sense safety standards for abortion drugs. Nothing in today's decision changes the fact that the FDA's own label says that roughly 1 in 25 women who take chemical abortion drugs will end up in the emergency room, a dangerous reality the doctors and medical associations we represent in this case know all too well. The FDA recklessly leaves women and girls to take these high-risk drugs all alone in their homes or dorm without requiring the ongoing in-person care of a doctor. While we're disappointed with the court's decision, we will continue to advocate for women and restore common sense safeguards for abortion drugs, like an initial office visit to screen for ectopic pregnancies. And we are grateful that 3 states stand ready to hold the FDA accountable for jeopardizing the health and safety of women and girls across the country." Kavanaugh wrote in the decision, "The plaintiffs may present their concerns and objections to the president and FDA in the regulatory process, or to Congress and the president in the legislative process. And they may also express their views about abortion and mifepristone to fellow citizens, including in the political and electoral processes." A spokesperson for Danco, the company that makes mifepristone, said, "We are pleased with the Supreme Court's decision in this incredibly important case. By rejecting the Fifth Circuit's radical, unprecedented, and unsupportable interpretation of who has standing to sue, the justices reaffirmed long-standing basic principles of administrative law. In doing so, they maintained the stability of the FDA drug approval process, which is based on the agency's expertise and on which patients, healthcare providers, and the U.S. pharmaceutical industry rely." The Fox article also quoted Clarence Thomas from his concurring opinion, writing, "The Alliance's attempted use of our associational standing doctrine illustrates how far we have strayed from the traditional rule that plaintiffs must assert only their own injuries. The Alliance is an association whose members are other associations. None of its members are doctors. Instead, the Alliance seeks to have associational standing based on injuries to the doctors who are members of its member associations. Thus, the allegedly injured parties, the doctors, are 2 degrees removed from the party before us pursuing those injuries. So this decision was not for or against abortion in any way. This decision said only that organizations made up of other organizations who cannot prove a direct harm in fact, cannot prove causation by the regulation of the agency, and then obviously, of course, cannot prove redressability for a harm they did not sustain, cannot be the party to bring this case to the court. They have other outlets where they can voice their concern and other approaches to pursue if they want to prevent easy access to this drug. All right, changing subjects completely without a segue. This is ABC News from Tuesday. Voting machine contract under scrutiny following discrepancies in Puerto Rico's primaries. Puerto Rico's Elections Commission said Tuesday that it's reviewing its contract with a U.S. electronic voting machine company after hundreds of discrepancies were discovered following the island's heated primaries. Must be under the heat dome. The problem stemmed from a software issue that caused machines supplied by Dominion Voting Systems to incorrectly calculate vote totals, said Jessica Padilla Rivera, the commission's interim president. While no one is contesting the results from the June 2nd primary that correctly identify the winners, machine-reported vote counts were lower than the paper ones in some cases, and some machines reversed certain totals or reported 0 votes for some candidates. You gotta love how they claim that the winners have been correctly identified, even though the voting system itself is incapable of doing that. The concern is that we obviously have elections in November, and we must provide the island not only with the assurance that the machine produces the correct result, but also that the result it produces is the same one that is reported, Padilla said. More than 6,000 Dominion voting machines were used in Puerto Rico's primaries, with the company stating that software issues stemmed from the digital files used to export results from the machine. So you see, the problem was only on the way out in the reporting. It's not in the voting. It can't be in the voting. If there's one problem these machines can't have, it's in the voting. And sure, there are problems with the voting, but these problems in this case, not the voting, just the exporting of results. You can rest assured that somewhere in that machine is the correct result, and by golly, we are going to get it out. The contract between Dominion and the Elections Commission ends June 30th. Oh, no. Jose Varela, vice president of Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, called for Padilla to appear at a public hearing Thursday to address the issues. I don't understand why Puerto Rico doesn't just quit the United States. The regime should just give Puerto Rico back to its people, just like Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel. We cannot allow the public's confidence in the voting process to continue to be undermined as we approach the general elections, he said. The problems called to mind the island's botched 2020 primaries, when a lack of ballots at some centers forced the government to reschedule voting in a first for the U.S. territory. Hey, it also reminds everyone of every botched election for the last 6 years, which is absolutely all of the elections. On June 2nd, Puerto Rico held primary elections to select gubernatorial candidates for the pro-statehood New Progressive Party and the Popular Democratic Party, which supports the island's territorial status. In a surprise upset, Jennifer Gonzalez, Puerto Rico's congressional representative, beat Governor Pedro Pierluisi in the primary held by the New Progressive Party. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico Representative Jesus Manuel Ortiz defeated Senator Juan Zaragoza in the primary held by their Popular Democratic Party. Okay, well, those could be entirely fictitious people, and none of us will ever know, because I'm quite certain we will never hear of those people ever again. Both parties reported hundreds of ballots showing inaccurate results, with the PNP reporting over 700 errors and the PPD pointing to some 350 discrepancies. These inaccuracies affected ballots for positions including governor, mayor, and resident commissioner. In response to the discrepancies, the Elections Commission conducted a full vote tally and audited paper receipts from hundreds of ballot counting machines. Now, wait a second. Didn't they just say that 6,000 Dominion machines were used? Why were there only hundreds audited? Were there only hundreds of ballot counting machines and the others were something else? It's hard to say because sometimes it requires multiple machines to be able to record your vote. And of course, that provides so many more opportunities for massive errors to occur. Edwin Garcia Feliciano, Puerto Rico's ombudsman, called the incident a threat to the island's electoral system and called on the governor and the island's federal control board that oversees the island's finances to establish a plan to guarantee a better outcome in the upcoming general elections. All planning is based on resolving emergencies, including unlikely ones, Garcia Feliciano said. But predictable circumstances, which are well known to the public, cannot be addressed by improvisation and in a rush. The island is now preparing for the November general election where voters will choose a new governor and local representatives. While Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, they are not allowed to vote in the U.S. presidential elections. So if all of this has left you feeling like you are a second-class citizen, don't worry, just remember that Puerto Ricans have it even worse. Naturally, I hope they get their election problems solved, and I'm very, very thankful that Dominion machines only mess up in U.S. territories and not here on the mainland, or else that might mean that Joe Biden didn't receive 81 million real lawful American votes, and the television says he did. People say it was stolen, but it wasn't. If that was true, the television would have to tell us. That's the law. It's like false advertising. You're not allowed to lie about what your product does on television. And the government definitely can't lie to you on television, even though that's exactly what the Smith Modernization Act allows them to do. And you know what's even better? They use your money to do it. And they tell you that state media is objective journalism. And how about that? I thought there was no segue, but it turns out there's two. And both of them are Nina Totenberg. Speaking of obvious, massive, glaring issues of election fraud in the United States, this is the Associated Press yesterday. Kari Lake loses Arizona appeals court challenge of 2022 loss in governor's race. Kari Lake lost an Arizona appeals court challenge arguing that thousands of Phoenix area mail ballot signatures were not properly verified when she lost the 2022 governor election to Democrat Katie Hobbs. The State Court of Appeals upheld on Tuesday a judge's finding last year that Kari Lake failed to prove inconsistencies in signatures were neglected by election verification staffers in Maricopa County, home to more than 60% of the voters in the state, especially according to the numbers produced by Arizona's totally unreliable electronic voting machines. Now, they really gave short shrift to the claims in Kari Lake's cases. The ballot signatures were checked by AI and then just verified one after the next by a human with a rate of under 3 seconds per ballot in the signature verification, which essentially means that one of the only possible security measures for mail-in balloting becomes essentially not a security check at all. Lake's attorney, Brian Blem, did not respond Wednesday to telephone and email messages about the appeals court decision and whether Lake would appeal to the Arizona Supreme Court. Blem also did not respond to requests for comment about sanctions imposed on him last Friday by the State Bar of Arizona for quote-unquote unequivocally false representations to the state Supreme Court while handling Lake election challenges. His 60-day suspension takes effect July 7th. That's ridiculous. Lake is a former television news anchor now running for U.S. Senate. She is considered the GOP frontrunner ahead of the July 30th party primary to face Democratic U.S. Rep. Ruben Gallego in November for the seat currently held by independent Kyrsten Sinema, who is not seeking a second term. Lake has been among the most vocal of GOP candidates, promoting former President Donald Trump's false claims that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from him. And we know there's no way that could happen. I mean, the election is very safe, very secure, the most secure election in our nation's history. Anyone who doesn't agree with that is making baseless claims on no evidence, at least none that's held up in courts if you just forget about all the evidence that totally has held up in courts. The Associated Press wants to make sure that you know Lake has lost several court challenges after refusing to acknowledge she lost the 2022 governor election to Katie Hobbs by more than 17,000 votes. Presiding appeals court judge Sean Briarcliff noted in Tuesday's ruling that Lake argued more than 8,000 ballots were maliciously configured to cause a tabulator rejection and were not counted. Even if all of the 8,000 allegedly uncounted votes had been for Lake, Briarcliff wrote, it would not have overcome the 17,000 vote differential between Lake and Hobbs. And that part is irrelevant. I expect that Kari Lake will appeal. I hope she'll appeal. I hope all of these cases keep going all the way up as far as they can go so that we get as much precedent as possible across the board. Tell us the rules of the game. Paint all the lines on the field, just wherever you want them. Give us whatever construct you want, and then let's go play ball. And we will beat you. These people are not scary. These people are retarded. If you don't believe me, all of the leaders of the free world were together today looking up at the sky like idiots. They looked like Hillary Clinton watching balloons fall from the ceiling at the 2016 Democrat National Convention. And then the parachute man landed right nearby, and Joe Biden just starts walking off camera in the other direction, just shuffling away from the group. Georgia Maloney had to go get him and bring him back and say, hey, Joe, do you see the parachute man? Isn't this amazing? This is the photo op where we show the world how important we are and how stylish and how we get to do all of these amazing things with other powerful people like us. A 17,000 vote difference that took them days to generate and has been the subject of ongoing lawsuits since then. How many ways does it need to be proven? It is not possible for our election system as it exists right now to produce legitimate outcomes. I'm not only saying it doesn't produce legitimate outcomes, I'm saying that the system itself makes it impossible. And of course, our public figures know this to be true and still accept the results of their own elections and the result of the presidential election. Why is it really only Donald Trump making this case to the American people? I guess we'll never know. And when I say it's really only Donald Trump making this case to the American people, I mean in the political realm, of course, many other people are making this case. No one more than Steve Bannon, who is, we're told, headed to prison in a few weeks. Vanity Fair, of all the outlets, decided to take this on yesterday. One of their most constantly triggered political reporters, I guess, her name is Bess Levin. Trump advisor Stephen Bannon cites podcast duties as reason he should not be required to report to prison. Days after being ordered to surrender by July 1st for a 4-month prison sentence, longtime Trump advisor Steve Bannon told Tucker Carlson, "In my 20s, I served my country on a Navy destroyer, and in my 70s, I'll serve my country in a federal prison. It doesn't make any difference to me. It won't change my life in one way." But apparently it actually does matter to him because last night he made a last-ditch attempt to stay out of the big house. Now, apparently Bess Levin is an idiot. You could prefer that something not happen, but still be fine with it and accept it if it does. I would rather it not rain later, but if it rains, I'm going to be okay. That's all Bannon's expressing. I am amazed that she is willing to publicize his stance on this, reframing a 4-month term in the slammer as a service to one's country. In an emergency motion filed Tuesday, Bannon, who was sentenced to time behind bars for contempt of Congress, asked a federal appeals court to let him remain free while he appeals his criminal conviction. Why does he think the court should grant him such a reprieve? Because he's trying to help re-elect Donald Trump, and also because he has a podcast that his listeners simply cannot be deprived of. The government seeks to imprison Mr. Bannon for the 4-month period leading up to the November election, when millions of Americans look to him for information on important campaign issues, Attorney Trent McCotter wrote in the filing. This would also effectively bar Mr. Bannon from serving as a meaningful advisor in the ongoing national campaign. Now, it's not like Steve Bannon was convicted of some crime out in the world, and it's not like he's a danger to anyone. This is a government imprisoning a media figure for not complying with the illegitimate demands of that government. If it was happening the other way around, they would be saying that an authoritarian, dictatorial, illegitimate administration was imprisoning journalists. They would take that to global governing bodies and human rights organizations. And keep your eyes open for that, because we are about to see a phase where regime-oriented, quote-unquote, journalists, who are really just intelligence assets, were involved with subverting the United States of America. And when they are indicted and prosecuted and tried and convicted and sentenced and imprisoned, all of these people will be making those exact complaints. Bannon hosts a show called War Room where, among other things, he is called for beheading top government officials and famously told listeners on January 5th, 2021, "We're on the point of attack. All hell will break loose tomorrow." None of that whatsoever constitutes an actual call for violence. He said he wanted to see heads on pikes. In a message to NBC News after a judge ordered him to surrender on July 1st, he wrote, "Who says I'm reporting? War Room cannot and will not be silenced." He added that the show's regular schedule would continue, saying 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 2 on Saturday. The War Room is a military command center for MAGA. Can't stop and won't until we achieve final victory. And cheers to Steve Bannon, because he's exactly right about the importance of the War Room. And also, I consider him my dad sometimes. Bannon was actually sentenced to prison all the way back in 2022, but was allowed to remain free pending appeal of his conviction. Last month, a 3-judge panel of a federal appeals court upheld his guilty conviction. Following that ruling, Judge Carl Nichols said the Trump advisor could no longer delay his time behind bars. In the emergency motion filed yesterday, Bannon asked the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit to overrule Nichols' order. His lawyers have argued that he should not have to go to prison until all of his avenues for appealing his conviction, including the Supreme Court, have been exhausted. And yeah, it seems pretty obvious that if there are still legal questions that need to be resolved, the government shouldn't be going around imprisoning American citizens until they are. And perhaps we will see this go down an even more interesting avenue. This is Matt Gaetz on the Tim Pool information op yesterday.
I believe the only way Steve Bannon does not go to jail is if there is a vote at an entity called the BLAG, the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group. It is made up of the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, the Majority Whip, the Minority Leader, and the Minority Whip. So the Republicans hold a 3-2 in this. Bannon is going to petition for an en banc review of this determination to revoke his bail. When he does, I believe the BLAG should and will take a 3-2 vote for the House to seek leave to file an amicus brief with the en banc court that the January 6th committee was illegitimate. It was illegitimately formed. It was a runaway committee. It did not have a proper minority member. And whether it's Peter Navarro or Steve Bannon, nobody should be sitting in a jail cell because they would not comply with the absurd musings of a committee unlike any before in our nation's history.
Talk me through that again. So he would go to this committee, this 5-person committee where there's 3 people.
Yes. Or 3 Republicans.
And if they vote in favor, then they would create.
And what they would do is they would go to the court and say, we want to tell the court that it is now the official view of the House of Representatives that the January 6th committee was illegitimate. Wow. And then Bannon's lawyers could ask the court to take judicial notice of that vote by the BLAG, which would then give them a basis to allow his bail to stay in effect.
And Republicans can do this with the majority.
The Republicans can do this without even taking a floor vote. Mike Johnson, Steve Scalise, and Tom Emmer can do it, and it is my belief that they are working toward that end as we speak.
Oh, wonderful. That's good news.
What's the justification?
What about Navarro?
He deserves the same thing.
Yeah, he deserved it yesterday. He shouldn't even be locked up.
All right. You see, now we're getting somewhere. For what, 2 years now? More than 2 years? I have referred to the January 6th committee as the illegitimate J6 committee, the sham J6 committee, the J6 primetime television show. And I have consistently made the argument that the illegitimate sham committee, constituted only for a primetime television show, admitted by them to be constituted for this purpose, to convince the American people that we really did have a very violent insurrection, that Donald Trump really did try to overthrow the country. That committee's report, by the way, was the basis for the court case in Colorado, the judge there determining that Donald Trump had committed an insurrection, which is what was then used by secretaries of state to try to remove Donald Trump from the ballot. And then we have the issue of the subpoenas as well. all of that from an illegitimate committee. I have said the entire time, an illegitimate committee can't do those things. We can talk about all the legal issues that are being argued about in the courts, all the arguments the attorneys on both sides are making, the way the courts decide these things, all good. Those can be important issues to look at, most especially if they come up again in the future going the other direction. It'll be good that we have that example. But underlying all of that is that the committee's not legitimate in the first place, which means they can't send out legitimate, enforceable subpoenas. And yes, I understand that Peter Navarro is reported to be in jail. That constitutes a massive injustice, and Peter Navarro should be made whole. But the critical point here is that the committee's not legitimate. Now, of course, I don't think the Congress is legitimate in itself, but the committee is certainly not legitimate. Matt Gaetz is suggesting that the leaders and whips of both parties and the Speaker of the House have a vote in the bipartisan legal advisory group to declare the J6 committee illegitimate and then file an amicus brief to the court that the actions taken by the prior Congress were improper and illegitimate, and that neither Steve Bannon or Peter Navarro nor anyone else should be punished for refusing to comply. Now, obviously, we don't know if they're going to do that. If they do that, we don't know what weight it's going to carry. Maybe it only delays things for a little while. I'm also not entirely certain this is the best way for that committee to be ruled illegitimate, considering it'll only be framed as biased by the media. But it would certainly spark an important conversation about the legitimacy of that committee, and that is an argument we are absolutely prepared to win, and that the people of this country at this point are prepared to accept. It's also worth considering whether or not this particular info up around the legitimacy of the J6 committee concerning these subpoenas and the punishments and prosecutions of Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, whether or not all of this is an attempt to defuse things before the Supreme Court potentially decides that the government should have never prosecuted anyone for obstructing an official proceeding. In April, an article in the outlet Find Law says that a broad ruling by SCOTUS could have a wide-reaching impact. Remember, it's not just Fisher who was charged under 18 U.S. Code Section 1512. Many other rioters, give me a break, and Donald Trump were as well. A ruling in favor of Fisher might well weaken the government's case against hundreds of other defendants from the Capitol attack and the former president. So that court decision could blow up the J6 prosecutions and the Jack Smith prosecution about the election in J6. In February, Tom Cotton and Jim Jordan filed a Supreme Court brief in support of Fisher, signed by an additional 21 Republican members of the House and Senate. This is from Newsweek, by the way. The Biden administration's pursuit of its political opponents must be stopped. Their strained interpretation of the law would criminalize vast swaths of everyday political conduct and violate the First Amendment. This is from Cotton. Congress never granted, and no administration should have, the power to lock up political opponents for 20 years for merely trying to influence Congress. So this could basically have 300 plus J6 cases tossed, and it would affect Jack Smith's case. Although he says that even if the court decides for Fisher, the obstruction charges he's brought against Trump would still stand based on his false statements, quote unquote. So this could be another massive loss by the regime, one of their major issues blowing right up in their faces. And thank goodness we've got all the child brains over on the Uniparty Left supporting the court's legitimacy in public right now. It's great, isn't it? I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's